Right now, the magnitude of the horror is such that simultaneously nothing is enough and everything matters. I suppose I can afford to be cynical because I live on the launching side of the bombs. So I'm simultaneously sort of hopeful and dejected all at once, relative to that question, because I feel something changing, but we also feel like it's a very long way from anything resembling justice. Everyone you talk to, there is a baseline level of rage at what's happening.
The book resonates with a lot of people because of precisely those feelings.
I don't think it's because it's a particularly good book. I think it's because the level of dehumanization and forced sort of silencing around this subject matter is of such magnitude that even a slight steam vent lets out so much air. Of seeing something that you know fundamentally is wrong and being told by every system of power surrounding you that no, not only is it good, it's necessary.
In the 1940s, people could argue or would argue that they didn't know what was happening behind the walls. To you, what is today's version of that? Is it, I don't understand the geopolitics? Is it too complicated? Because the genocide in Gaza is being live streamed. The internet removes that last sort of fig leaf of plausible deniability. Or has it just widened, let's say, the world's capacity to look away? One day, when it's safe, when there is no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, when it's too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will have always been against this. This was a tweet posted by award-winning Egyptian-Canadian novelist and journalist Omar El Akkad on X in October 2023. It is also the title of his recently published New York Times Bestseller, which has also been nominated for the 2025 Palestine Book Awards. A memoir and a reckoning with what it means to live in a West that betrays its fundamental values. Omar spent the past 2 decades reporting on major world events, the so-called war on terror, Ferguson, climate change, and more. And for almost 2 years now, he's been watching the carnage, the genocide in Gaza enabled by the West. Look, Omar, your title, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, it's quite triggering, especially to someone from Gaza. But I think it would be even more triggering when that one day finally comes along. We spent how long listening to Matthew Miller, for example, Biden's State Department spokesperson, deny, dodge, and evade every question about Israel's war crimes in Gaza. And now that there is some shy shift of the tide and he's no longer in a place of authority, he comes along and lo and behold, he says that he believes that Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza.
I think it is without a doubt true that Israel has committed war crimes.
You wouldn't have said that at the podium.
Yeah, look, because when you're at the podium, you're not expressing your personal opinion. You're expressing the conclusions of the United States government.
Biden, after he left office, gave unusually frank accounts of his frustrations with Netanyahu as well. Heck, even I'll take you back to John Kerry in 2016. With his final speech as U.S. Secretary of State, once he had basically one foot out of the door, he went all out. He, called Israel out on its settlement expansion. He essentially gave a eulogy for the two-state solution, so much so that Netanyahu came out and he accused him of paying lip service to what he called Palestinian terrorism.
Certainly in the world, have any idea how broad and systematic the process has become.
So there is a pattern where moral clarity and public honesty only seem to arrive after people have left positions of authority and after the sort of bad deed has already been done, rather than when it matters most. So my question to you is, why do you think it takes leaving power for the Western leaders to say what they clearly knew all along? And what does that tell us about these institutions themselves?
I suppose the short answer is because, at least I believe, because at all times these people are engaging in a kind of calculus of personal survival, and self-preservation. And the combined emphasis on their own careers and their own personal progress, coupled with the complete absence of emphasis on the notion that Palestinians might be human beings, results in exactly this kind of situation. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, nor do I need to tell you, you know this full well, how many times I've seen someone do exactly what you've described, and they have the word former in front of their title, in front of their job title. You know, former UN this, former spokesperson for this powerful person, former politician of some kind or another. And I think one of the many sort of frustrating aspects of witnessing the last 20 months is that I know that it's irrational for me to be more angry and more filled with rage at this particular kind of human being than, say, the person who is actively engaged in this slaughter. But with a person who's actively engaged, I know where I stand relative to a monster. I know how to oppose that. But with this kind of diaphanous moral worldview, where you can just slither in and out of positions at any given moment, all in service of what? I mean, someone like Miller, the State Department spokesperson, they're infinitely protected. Nothing is coming to their door. They'll never be sitting in The Hague. And like you said, this isn't a phenomenon of the current genocide. This is a phenomenon that goes along with essentially a three-quarter century long occupation. We've seen it happen over and over and over again. We've seen Barack Obama get caught on a hot mic explaining that he knows full well what kind of human being Netanyahu is. We've seen all of these officials over and over. The second they're done, suddenly come up with this moral clarity. And it's a reminder. It's a reminder of what kind of system we're contending with. And I think that's really the only upside of it, is that once you've seen this happen, you can no longer sort of harbor illusions about a baseline level of good faith in any of this. And at the very, very least, that is clarifying.
I mean, you came to the West believing that it promised freedom and justice for all. How changed are you today?
At the institutional level, or with respect to the institutional level, I'm fully changed. And I think if I had more of a backbone, or if I was less oblivious, or if it was less rewarding for me to be that oblivious, this would have happened a long time ago. And this might have happened when I was covering the early years of the war on terror, or when I was reporting from Afghanistan and I saw how the Afghanistani soldiers were treated compared to the NATO soldiers, or when I was in Gitmo and I saw the entire legal system be tossed aside and replaced with an ad hoc one designed to gain convictions that ironically never gained really many convictions at all. At any of these moments, I might have come to this conclusion relative to the power centers of the West. Relative to the individuals who live in this part of the world and the communities they form, I don't think I've ever been more inspired. I mean, even now where I live, on the West Coast in the US, I'm watching people not too far from me take on the most powerful militarized police force in the world in support of essentially some of the most powerless human beings in this country, to keep them from getting deported, to keep them from having their families torn apart, to keep them from getting snatched off the street into unmarked vans by officers who can't even show their faces. At an individual level, I'm watching people take a stand. Is it enough? Probably not. Right now, the magnitude of the horror is such that simultaneously nothing is enough and everything matters. Every last little piece of resistance, even those letters to Congress people, to senators, that they never read, even that, everything, even something as meaningless as this book I've written, everything feels simultaneously not enough, and yet it matters. But at an institutional level, I think that I've gone from a place where I fundamentally believed that there was an inherent set of principles that were fundamentally good in their nature, equal justice, equal rights under the law, etc., etc., that no matter how ugly the present veneer was, still held up the entire endeavor. Um, and I think I was personally rewarded for that belief in many, many ways, including the fact that I don't think someone, for example, who doesn't have this accent could have gotten this book published at a major publisher. And I don't know that I believe any of that anymore.
You talked about having done journalistic work and covering all these things. What kind of emotional work were you doing through this book that you couldn't do as a journalist, for instance? Particularly that events like this, it's the role of a journalist to kind of lay it out as it is.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think that there's a couple of things that come to mind. Um, the first, honestly, is the work that I was not so much able to do as able to not do, basically. And what I mean by that is that there's a traditional mode of journalism in which the journalist is self-deleting. You step out of the picture. And so, for example, when I'm in Afghanistan, and I often come back to this, um, we go to the forward operating bases, and you would see who was put on the front lines of the base, who was set to guard the outside where all the attacks are going to happen. And that's always the local soldiers. And these were kids, right? Like 18 years old. Um, no training, no equipment, not even the flak vests. Um, and it's clear their lives are considered to be worth less than those of the NATO soldiers who are sitting inside. And it's clear to everyone that this is how it is. I could write about that, but I couldn't bring myself into that story. And I understand how incredibly self-centered that sounds. And maybe it is incredibly self-centered, but there's an element of self-interrogation that you have to do because you are essentially benefiting from the same set of privileges that are wholly dependent on this hierarchy of human life. And at least with my very limited talent as a journalist, I could not find a way to engage in that kind of self-interrogation. Um, and I think the book allowed me to do that. I mean, I often say that there's not a single thing that this book indicts or interrogates that I'm not directly complicit in, that I haven't benefited from directly. And so to be able to open that up and sort of autopsy it, I think was necessary for a book like this, even at the obvious cost of seeming self-centered or seeming to sort of cast the spotlight on myself and all the rest of that. And that is an incredibly valid criticism of the work. But I don't think I could have written this kind of book and simply skated past the fact that by either being oblivious to it or actively or passively supporting it, I have benefited a great deal. So that was one of the elements that I think I couldn't have done in the kind of journalism career that I had.
And when you watch journalists today, particularly the mainstream media, how do you see the coverage of this genocide, the evolution, shall we say, of the coverage of this genocide from the get-go?
I sort of split my answer into the short-term answer and the long-term answer. Um, in the short term, I can't tell you how many journalists from some of the biggest publications in this country in the United States have come to these events for this book and have talked to me afterwards about how disgusted they are with the setup at their news organizations. There's this incredible fracture between the front lines of these organizations, the journalists doing the reporting, and the administrative or managerial side. Um, and that's not to say that those are two sort of holistic monoliths. Certainly, I'm sure there's journalists who are actively very much in favor of this genocide and are proceeding accordingly. And I'm sure there's people at the managerial level who feel like, well, if I can just get in the room, I can change things. And, more power to you, I suppose. But generally speaking, when these reporters have come to talk to me, there's an understanding, again, that something is rotten at the institutional level, at the power center level. I have immense respect for most journalists. I think they do an incredibly difficult job under incredibly difficult circumstances. They're poorly paid for it. Their mistakes are a matter of public record forever. They get yelled at by everyone all of the time. They're supposed to get yelled at. A good journalism is telling a story somebody somewhere doesn't want told. And so by definition, you're getting yelled at. That doesn't make it pleasant, though. So I think in the short term, you're watching reporters have to work under conditions that they themselves know are conducive to bad journalism. Um, and you see this all of the time. Anyone who's ever worked at a newspaper will tell you that there's the story, and there's a story the reporter writes. But then there's things like the headline, and the photo caption, and the placement or lack of placement. And all of those things are institutional measures. And so you might get a story where the reporter knows what's happening.
Mm.
They know who blew up that hospital. They know this nonsense about Hamas running tunnels underneath is exactly that. They know it's nonsense. They know all of these things. And then you get a headline about how a hospital has spontaneously combusted, essentially, right? The institution goes to work. So I think this frustration is present in the short term. I think in the long term, the damage that has been done to my former industry is very hard to calculate. I think there's an entire generation of folks who are going to have a fundamental lack of trust in the entire Institute of Journalism as a result of the last 20 months. Just as I run into people in this town, and I'm sure everywhere, who essentially only get their news from the sort of major mainstream news organizations. And for them, it may well be that this genocide is absolutely not happening at all. There's an entire generation of human beings who are learning to abandon these organizations entirely because they're seeing a reality through other means of getting their information that is effectively letting them know that something really fraudulent is happening within sort of mainstream media organizations. And whether you agree with me or not that this is happening, you have to be cognizant as somebody working in this. I'm sorry, I keep saying you. Obviously, I mean the royal you, I suppose. Um, that you have to be cognizant that this is going to cause incalculable damage to the Institute of Journalism. Um, and I don't know how you recover from that. Because once somebody realizes that you can look away as an institution from something of this magnitude, what can't you look away from in a pinch? Um, and I think we're going to see the results and consequences and after effects of that for years, maybe decades to come.
I'm sure you've seen some journalists take a harder line, especially with Israeli spokespersons in recent weeks. Why do you think that shift has come about in the line of questioning and sort of interrogating the facts on the ground? Whereas previously, let's say the first year and a half, it seemed to be more of a take their statements more at face value kind of report. So we'll put it to you and then you respond, and that's that.
Yeah, I think there's a whole host of reasons. Um, I think early on the narrative, and this is, completely understandable, I suppose, um, was essentially one of this horrific thing has happened, And that's the start and the end of it. History begins here. This is going to reset. It never resets when Palestinians are the victims. That's never the starting point of history. Um, and I think that leads me to the second reason, which is that there's an institutional power to the nation state. I mean, that's the most obvious thing to say in the world. Um, if you're working for the BBC or the New York Times, there's a difference between getting yelled at by a Palestinian family because you got their names wrong and essentially completely mischaracterized the slaughter of an entire uh, line of the family tree versus getting yelled at by the official spokesperson of the Israeli government or something like that, right? The institutional power that comes into play factors into um, not only the way you respond to a story, but the way you think about covering it in the first place. So I think that factors into it. Um, I think generally speaking, with every major media organization, there is a lure to believing the institutional because this is where you spend a lot of your time. And this isn't just a case with Israel. This is, if you work in DC and you're a White House correspondent, you are working within the machinery of the power center so much of the time. Not only are you in the White House press briefing room, but you get to know these people. You get to know the spokespeople. You get to know the official assistants and the person who hands you the press release and picks up the phone, and you become friendly with them. You don't do that for every Palestinian family that's been killed. You don't do that for any Palestinian family who's been on the receiving end of one of these bombs that my tax dollars pay for. And so I think no journalist will admit this outright, or maybe very few will, but I think there's an element of friendliness there. There's the natural sort of antagonism that should be at play when you are questioning somebody um, starts to fade away. And that's part of the reason why so many of the best political stories are done by these outsiders who jump into the cesspool, get the story, and get the hell out. Because a lot of people who spend every single day in that cesspool become part of it, and are less likely to want to upset the ecosystem that they're in. So I think all of that comes into play. Um, and I think there is also the same kind of calculus at play that these politicians are making, or former politicians, I suppose, which is, how am I going to be remembered? Um, but the single most important reason, I think anyway, is that there's a buildup of public pressure to do better than this. And this is the same thing that's driving these politicians who suddenly wake up and realize how horrible this is. It's also driving these journalists. And that to me is the most important reason because it implies that you are capable of doing something better than this. You just need to be pushed. Um, and so I think, especially in the last few weeks, I just came back from a tour of Madrid, Barcelona. I was in Europe for a couple of weeks. And the level of sort of public outrage, even over the course of that 2 week period, seems to have heightened. Um, and that's making a difference. And I think it's going to continue making a difference.
So, do you think we are at that point where we start to see a shift, a real shift? And if we are, does that entail action or is it lip service?
If you'd asked me a few weeks ago, I would have probably said, no, we're not even close. Now, that's because I'm a naturally deeply cynical guy, and I suppose I can afford to be cynical because I live on the launching side of the bombs. That's how big the change feels to me. Because again, you move one level up into the halls of power,
Yeah.
and the narrative is largely unchanged. The narrative is that there's this group of people, and we won't say it outright, but they're kind of savage in their nature, and for civilization to sort of continue functioning, we have to sort of do this to them, right? Like that's what they deserve, and this has been the kind of Western narrative around Palestinians for as long as I've been alive. This notion that there's these stubborn people who, if they would just take the crumbs we're throwing to them, wouldn't have to be punished in this way, right? Like that's been sort of the defining aspect of the narrative that's been fed to me and most everyone in the West. And you look at it, and it really hasn't changed that much. But you also see a public buildup of pressure that I think will result in a change. And it's infuriating to say because how many people have to die before we get to that place? Right now, there's an element of lip service, but you're starting to see consequences, right? For the first time in my life, I can say that the suffering of the Palestinian people played a significant role in the outcome of a US presidential election, which I could have never said before. Now, you can make the case that there were a million other factors at play, but the reality that this was one of them is mind-boggling to me, and it still is, because the dehumanization and disappearance, narratively speaking, of the Palestinian people has been a given in US domestic politics. So that matters, I think. But again, it's glacial. It's absolutely glacial. So I'm simultaneously sort of hopeful and dejected all at once, relative to that question, because I feel something changing, but we also feel like it's a very long way from anything resembling justice.
Again, with your title, I feel that I find myself thinking about the Zone of Interest, the film, which zooms in on the lives of those living next to a concentration camp, going about their lives like it's not happening. Um, you see in that film that the horror of what was happening is made even more unbearable by how bearable it was for those living next to it. But in the 1940s, people could argue or would argue that they didn't know what was happening behind the walls. Um, to you, what is today's version of that? Is it, I don't understand the geopolitics? Is it too complicated? Because the genocide in Gaza is being live streamed. The internet removes that last sort of fig leaf of plausible deniability. Or has it just widened, let's say, the world's capacity to look away?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, which makes it um, even more frustrating how unsatisfactory an answer I'm about to give you. So I apologize for that. But I was thinking about this a lot for precisely the reason you outlined, which is this notion that certainly of any conflict in my lifetime, and to call this a conflict, I think, is deeply euphemistic, but bear with me. Um, this was the most overt. I mean, when I talk about the ways in which the last 20 months have changed me as a human being, I'm often asked this question of, well, why not the war on terror? Or why not Sudan? Why not this? Why not that? And a lot of times that question is asked in bad faith. It's asked by someone who doesn't care about any of these issues, but just sort of wants to get me to shut up. And I get that. That's fine. But I think for me, there's a level of intimacy and immediacy and complicity. I keep coming back to those three things because I'm not just seeing this up close. I'm not just hearing the screams. I'm not just watching people beg for their lives. I'm not. This is a case of witnessing it almost as it happens. And I know that shouldn't matter. I know that just as a human being with a soul, at least I'd like to think, it shouldn't matter to me whether I'm seeing this almost as it happens or a month later or whatever, but it does. Right? And then knowing that I'm doing that, right? I'm killing those kids. But I kept thinking about this over and over again. Like, we know, we know. And why is it that so many of the same zone of interest type currents are at play? even though we know we have now documented evidence that were it happening to any other entity on this earth, would have every single mechanism of international law kicking in immediately, would be described in the clearest terms for what it is. And yet, the emails come in and the bills are due, and we go to the cocktail parties and we do the thing over and over. And I think it occurred to me at some point that I was thinking about it maybe the wrong way. Because there was an implicit kind of assumption in my head that the missing piece here was a kind of knowing. That in previous cases we simply didn't know enough. And now we do, so something must change. And it occurred to me that that's not the missing piece. The missing piece is consequence. This could be happening in this room right now. Right? I could be watching that Israeli soldier put 300, or I suppose multiple Israeli soldiers, put at least 350 bullets into Hind Rajab's car. I could be watching it happen down the street. And if there's absolutely no consequences to me looking away, I think the impulse will always be to look away. And so this is what I think is at play. We argue that now there's no excuse. Sure, there's no excuse, but there's also no consequence. I live in Portland. Virtually everyone I meet every single day has the privilege of going about their lives as though none of this is happening. And I can pull out my cell phone and I can show them what it looks like when a 6-year-old girl starves to death. I can show them what it looks like when a toddler is torn in half by the force of a blast. And it will still be the case that there is, other than me yelling at them, which they can easily shut out of their lives, other than the occasional protest blocking a freeway so that they're late to work or something like that, the relative magnitude of the consequences is essentially nothing. And I think that's the factor that partially answers that question. It's not that we don't know, and maybe we knew all along in every one of these cases.
Yeah.
It's that we can live our lives as though we don't.
Do you think it would have made any difference at all if international journalists were indeed let in? Because at the moment, as it stands, everything that comes out of Gaza, Israeli officials would cast doubt on the authenticity or, reality of what was being reported by Palestinian journalists.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think early on it wouldn't, which is maybe a weird thing to say, and maybe I'm completely wrong, as is the case, obviously, with all of these answers. But the reason I'm inclined to think that it wouldn't have made perhaps as much of a difference as I would like to believe in my head as a former journalist who tends to want to believe that good journalism can change the world for the better. And I think one of the reasons I'm inclined not to believe it as much as I otherwise would is because the overall framing wouldn't have changed. The overall framing is that this is a conflict of equals, that this began on October 7th, that there was no occupation, there was no 70 plus years of degradation and humiliation, and in many cases, outright eradication. And so all the reporting, I think, from mainstream news outlets in my part of the world would have had to remain within that framing.
It would have been
And so,
tolerated.
yeah, you would have gotten the conflict equivalent of most political coverage in the United States, which is a horse race. There's two teams, and this one has done this, and this one has done it. And that, I think, would have continued in such a way as to allow a lot of this carnage to happen. But I think after the fact, when international journalists are finally allowed back into Gaza, I think it's going to make a huge difference, because everything that Palestinian journalists have been telling us will now be corroborated by worthy white people. And the second that happens, there will be a narrative exit sign for people who have had the privilege to be oblivious to all of this, to be agnostic to all of this, to remain in this bubble of so-called neutrality, to suddenly be able to say, oh, I had no idea. But now that this guy from NBC is telling me, well, this changes everything. Um, and I think that will be a narrative sort of escape chute that people can go down. Um, so I think once it happens now, it'll make a difference. But early on, I think the narrative framing was ironclad, and any journalist from these major organizations who tried to get around that would have probably at best been reassigned and more likely probably lost their jobs for it.
I think I agree because, the framing and the dehumanization that you were talking about earlier, if we see how much even wanting to say, I don't want Palestinian children to be killed en masse would cause an absolute storm, like, for instance, with Miss Rachel. I don't know if you've been following the controversy.
Mm-hmm.
She's a children's entertainer. All she is saying is that she does not want to see those children die, those children to be killed. And yet, look at the storm that kicked up. So yeah, I agree. I think it goes a lot deeper than just, here are the facts. This is actually happening.
Yeah.
The West has certainly sustained and justified the genocide. And I think in your book you talk a lot about your place and the West and how you feel about the Western values, so-called Western values. But my final question to you is how you view today Muslim and Arab countries. I believe Palestinians would be feeling a lot more let down by them standing by and watching.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting because I this is such a silly thing to say, but like I don't think there's a single particularly revolutionary or controversial thing in this book. I can't even tell you that it's a good book. Um, it feels to me to be like the least I can do as a human being and still call myself a writer who, at least said something in the middle of what I think is the worst atrocity of my lifetime.
Mm.
But of course, there's an Arab Muslim guy's name on the cover, and so you're going to get the usual, you're going to get the go back where you came from. And the sort of person who says that, I always want to tell them, like, you go back where I came from. You would love it. You would absolutely. And there's a section in the book where I go at this, right? You would love the level of repression there and the level of forced agreement with the party line. Like, it seems like the kind of thing that would be right up your alley. I was back in Qatar teaching in November of last year. And I always say yes to requests from Qatar because that's where I grew up and I always want to go see my high school friends and stuff. I think otherwise um, probably wouldn't be the case. But I was there and of course everyone you talk to, there is a baseline level of rage at what's happening that I don't think I need to sort of explain.
I think it is why a lot of people kind of resonate with the book. It resonates with them. The book resonates with a lot of people because of precisely those feelings.
Yeah, and I think again, I don't think it's because it's a particularly good book. I think it's because the level of dehumanization and forced sort of silencing around this subject matter is of such magnitude that even a slight steam vent lets out so much air, lets out so much pressure. Every book event I did, somebody would come up to me and say, like, this is the first time that I've been in the space. And look, they don't care about me, they don't care about the book. It's not that. It's that they know if they talk about it at work, they'll get fired. If they talk about it with their friends, they might lose friends, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there is that element of this buildup of seeing something that fundamentally is wrong and being told by every system of power surrounding you that no, not only is it good, it's necessary, and
The
it needs to keep
gaslighting.
yeah, the gaslighting. And so anyway, you're in a place like Qatar, you're in Egypt, you're in most of the Arab world, and you see the rage at the ground level, and you know it's there. And then you look up, and in Doha, maybe there's a giant Palestinian flag flying off some building, and nothing flies off any building in a place like Qatar without the government's approval, so you know that this has been signed off on. But that's it. You try to do anything more than that, and you will be shut down immediately. I had a friend who went to Saudi Arabia for a Umrah and was dragged by the religious police and had no idea why, was dragged to the station and only realized after like an hour of interrogation that they had a shirt with the word Palestine on it and that was a step too far. And so, I often say that the last 20 months have made me lose quite a bit of respect for the governments of the Arab world, which is saying something because I didn't have that much respect to begin with. Um, I think the same calculus that we started this interview talking about is at play among these governments, and they are trying to balance the rage of their own population with the imposed inaction that is necessary to maintain good relations with the West, um, with the knowledge that the last thing you want to do as an authoritarian leader of a country is put actual support behind a population that knows resistance better than almost any other population on Earth. Because the worst thing that can happen from that perspective is that resistance proves contagious and then makes it into your own population. And so the level of lip service that is paid to the Palestinian people throughout the Arab world is like genuinely impressive, in the most horrific kind of way. Because the only thing that matches it in terms of intensity is the deliberate inaction once it comes time to actually do something. Um, and again, in an absolute sense, I know that Arab governments are fairly low down on the list of who I should be angry at for this genocide. And yet, in that deeply irrational way, I find that they are the subject of so much of my frustration, simply because no matter how many times I'm proven wrong, I keep wanting to expect something better than this.
Um, like you said, it's people feel like there is a bit of a breather that comes with when they read your book. I think you're speaking the minds of a lot of people and venting. So is it possible that you would read maybe something from the book, uh, any short excerpt that?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to read from the prologue.
Mm.
Um, I spent a lot of time on this prologue. That's not to say it's good or anything, but it was just where I spent a lot of my time, and it's the only part of the book that has any Arabic writing in it, literally like 2 lines. And it took us 6 months to typeset it because nobody at Penguin Random House speaks Arabic. And so I would send them the text and it would come back backwards and the letters are disconnected and so on and so forth. Um, this is um, this is a paragraph about, I think, something that lives in the heart of what a lot of this book deals with. Beyond the high walls and barbed wire and checkpoints that pen this place, there is the Empire. And the Empire as well is cocooned inside its own fortress of language. A language through the prism of which buildings are never destroyed, but rather spontaneously combust, in which blasts come and go like Chinooks over the mountain, and people are killed as though to be killed is their only natural and rightful ordering of their existence, as though living was the aberration. And this language might protect the empire's most bloodthirsty fringe, but the fringe has no use for linguistic malpractice. It is instead the middle, the liberal, well-meaning, easily upset middle that desperately needs the protection this kind of language provides. Because it is the middle of the empire that must look upon this and say, yes, this is tragic, but necessary, because the alternative is barbarism. The alternative to the countless killed and maimed and orphaned and left without home, without school, without hospital, and the screaming from under the rubble, and the corpses disposed of by vultures and dogs, and the days-old babies left to scream and starve, is barbarism.
Omar, I wish we never had to have this conversation, but it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
لأني ولدت فلسطينيا لأن جذوري في عمق الدهور لأني ولدت عربيا وأني في القدس من فجر العصور أموت كل يوم أموت كل يوم القدس لنا دوما القدس لن تموت القدس